Have you ever wondered why your moments of deepest insight often follow your greatest pain? There's a curious pattern in human experience that few dare to examine closely. Our most profound awareness, our deepest sense of self, typically emerges not during comfort and ease, but in the aftermath of suffering. The person who has never truly suffered remains, in some essential way, asleep, living on the surface of existence without access to the depths that pain alone seems able to create. Consider the biographical pattern that appears with remarkable consistency across history's most conscious individuals, from artists and philosophers to spiritual leaders and innovative thinkers. Almost invariably, we find that their exceptional consciousness developed not despite their suffering, but because of it. Their pain wasn't an unfortunate obstacle to their development, but the very chisel that carved their depth of awareness. This pattern appears so consistently that it suggests a profound connection between suffering and consciousness that conventional wisdom fails to acknowledge. Friedrich Nietzsche, that relentless investigator of uncomfortable truths, recognized this connection with unusual clarity. Having experienced extraordinary physical and emotional suffering himself, chronic illness, social isolation, professional rejection, he discovered that pain served a psychological function beyond mere warning or punishment. Pain, he realized, was consciousness's primary sculptor, the force that carves inner space and depth within the human psyche. This insight stands in stark contrast to our modern impulse to eliminate all discomfort, suggesting that our quest for painless existence might inadvertently be preventing our deepest awakening. What if the very experiences we most desperately avoid, rejection, failure, loss, illness, are precisely what create the inner depth we most deeply crave? What if consciousness itself doesn't merely perceive pain, but is actually formed by it, shaped through suffering into something that couldn't exist without this difficult passage? This possibility challenges our fundamental assumption that pain is merely an unfortunate accident to be eliminated, rather than an essential catalyst for our deepest development. As we explore this counterintuitive connection between suffering and consciousness, I invite you to consider your own experience. Think of the moments when you've felt most profoundly alive, most deeply aware, when you've experienced not just intellectual understanding but bone-deep knowing. How many of these moments emerged not from comfort and ease but from confrontation with life's most challenging aspects? What depth was created within you by experiences you would never have chosen, but now recognize as essential to who you've become? When we carefully examine how human consciousness develops, a curious pattern emerges, one that challenges conventional understanding of both suffering and awareness. Despite our natural impulse to avoid pain, historical and psychological evidence consistently shows that our deepest consciousness emerges precisely through encounters with suffering, rather than through experiences of comfort and pleasure. This pattern appears so consistently across diverse cultures and historical periods that it suggests a fundamental relationship between pain and consciousness that mainstream perspectives have failed to acknowledge. The anomaly becomes apparent when we examine biographies of individuals renowned for exceptional consciousness, whether artistic, philosophical, spiritual, or psychological. From Dante's descent into the Inferno before his ascent to paradise, to Buddha's recognition of universal suffering as the path to enlightenment, to countless artists whose creative breakthroughs followed periods of intense personal crisis, we find that heightened consciousness consistently emerges through confrontation with pain rather than its avoidance. This biographical pattern appears far too consistently to be mere coincidence. This contradiction becomes even more striking when we observe how consciousness changes during significant suffering. While intense pain can initially overwhelm awareness, its aftermath often brings extraordinary clarity and depth. Survivors of serious illness, profound grief, or major life disruptions frequently report not just recovery, but transformation, describing themselves as more awake, seeing clearly for the first time, or truly conscious in ways they weren't before their suffering. These testimonies suggest pain somehow expands consciousness rather than merely challenging it. The anomaly deepens when we consider the relationship between suffering and empathy. Psychological research consistently shows that individuals who have experienced significant personal suffering typically demonstrate greater capacity for empathetic understanding than those whose lives have been relatively pain-free. This correlation suggests suffering doesn't merely affect individual consciousness, but actually expands its scope, enabling deeper connection with others' experiences. Why would pain, which we instinctively avoid as harmful, consistently produce this positive expansion of conscious awareness? Perhaps most tellingly, therapeutic breakthroughs typically occur not by avoiding painful awareness, but by moving toward it with conscious attention. Whether in psychoanalysis, trauma therapy, addiction recovery, or spiritual practices, transformative healing consistently involves facing precisely the pain we've been avoiding, rather than finding more effective ways to escape it. This therapeutic pattern suggests that conscious engagement with suffering creates psychological integration that avoidance prevents, revealing pain as potentially generative rather than merely destructive. This anomalous relationship between suffering and consciousness appears even in neuroscience, where research shows that the neural networks associated with physical pain substantially overlap with those involved in complex consciousness. The anterior cingulate cortex and insula, crucial for pain processing, also play central roles in self-awareness, empathy, and complex emotional cognition. This neurological overlap suggests the capacity to experience pain and the capacity for complex consciousness may be fundamentally connected rather than merely coincidental. These anomalies caught the attention of Friedrich Nietzsche, who recognized them as evidence of a profound psychological pattern, what he called the birth of tragedy in human consciousness. His investigation would lead to a radical reinterpretation of suffering's function, one that religious and philosophical authorities have systematically resisted acknowledging for nearly 150 years. What psychological purpose might suffering serve in developing consciousness? Why would our deepest awareness emerge through painful experiences rather than pleasant ones? And what happens when we recognize pain not as unfortunate accident, but as essential catalyst for our deepest awakening? These questions point toward a fundamentally different understanding of both suffering and consciousness, one that contemporary culture, with its emphasis on comfort and pain avoidance, has largely overlooked. In May 1872, a 27-year-old Friedrich Nietzsche published his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. In this groundbreaking text, he examined how ancient Greek tragedy transformed suffering into consciousness through artistic representation. Unlike conventional scholarship that treated tragedy as mere literary form, Nietzsche recognized it as profound psychological insight into how consciousness itself emerges through confrontation with life's painful aspects. This radical interpretation marked the beginning of his lifelong investigation into the relationship between suffering and awareness. Nietzsche's personal circumstances uniquely positioned him to recognize this connection. Born in 1844 to a Lutheran pastor father who died painfully of brain disease when Friedrich was only 4 years old, young Nietzsche experienced profound loss early in life. This childhood trauma was compounded by his own deteriorating health, debilitating migraines, severe stomach ailments, and progressive vision problems that would eventually force his retirement from his professorship at Basel University at age 34. These experiences of intense physical suffering weren't incidental to his philosophy, but central to its development, providing experiential verification of the consciousness-expanding potential of pain. This biographical context is crucial for understanding Nietzsche's approach to suffering. Unlike philosophers theorizing from positions of comfort, Nietzsche developed his insights while experiencing relentless physical pain and social isolation. His recognition of suffering's consciousness-creating function wasn't abstract speculation, but lived discovery. As he wrote in Exe Homo, "My existence is a terrible burden. I would have rejected it long ago had I not made the most instructive tests and experiments upon myself in spiritual moral matters. I have a hand for switching perspectives. The first reason why a revaluation of values is perhaps possible for me alone." Nietzsche's intellectual preparation for this insight began with his immersion in ancient Greek culture as classical philologist. He recognized that pre-Socratic Greeks related to suffering differently than later Western civilization. Rather than interpreting pain as punishment, failure, or problem to be eliminated, Early Greek thought embraced tragedy as consciousness-expanding confrontation with existence's fundamental challenges. This perspective didn't position suffering as unfortunate accident, but recognized it as essential catalyst for deeper awareness, a view later obscured by Platonic Christian traditions that interpreted suffering as either moral failure or test to be endured for future reward. This understanding was reinforced by Nietzsche's engagement with Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy, which identified suffering as fundamental to human experience. While Schopenhauer concluded that suffering made existence something to be negated through renunciation, Nietzsche eventually rejected this conclusion. Instead of seeking to escape suffering, Nietzsche proposed engaging it consciously as the very process through which deeper awareness emerges. As he wrote in The Gay Science, "Only great pain, the long, slow pain that takes its time, compels us philosophers to descend into our ultimate depths." Most significantly, Nietzsche brought psychological insight to questions traditionally treated as metaphysical or moral. Rather than debating whether suffering was divinely ordained punishment or test, he asked, what psychological function does pain serve in developing consciousness? How does suffering transform awareness? This psychological approach bypassed theological debates to focus on observed patterns in human experience, making his insights accessible regardless of metaphysical beliefs. During his most productive period, 1878–1888, these intellectual threads converged in Nietzsche's comprehensive analysis of suffering's relationship to consciousness. In works like Human All Too Human, Daybreak, The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and Beyond Good and Evil, he developed his understanding of pain not as unfortunate accident, but as essential catalyst for psychological depth. This perspective represented radical departure from both religious interpretations of suffering as divine punishment and scientific approaches that treated pain as mere neurological warning system. This insight challenged fundamental assumptions of Western civilization, which increasingly positioned comfort and pain avoidance as primary goals. Against this cultural current, Nietzsche proposed that the elimination of suffering might actually prevent our deepest psychological development. As he provocatively stated in Beyond Good and Evil, the discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? This perspective wasn't glorification of suffering for its own sake, but recognition of its transformative potential when engaged consciously, rather than merely endured or avoided. As Nietzsche developed this understanding through his philosophical works, he recognized its revolutionary implications. If consciousness emerges primarily through confrontation with suffering rather than its avoidance, traditional moral frameworks that interpreted pain as punishment or failure required fundamental reconsideration. What evidence supported this radical reinterpretation of suffering's function? And why have religious and philosophical authorities so consistently resisted acknowledging this possibility? The first compelling evidence for Nietzsche's understanding of suffering's relationship to consciousness came from his philological analysis of ancient Greek tragedy. As classical scholar trained at the prestigious University of Leipzig, he discovered that the Greek word pathos, the root of our modern term pathology, originally signified not just suffering, but transformative experience that expanded awareness. This linguistic connection suggested the ancient Greeks recognized pain not merely as unfortunate affliction, but as consciousness-altering passage that created psychological depth. This linguistic evidence aligned with Nietzsche's analysis of Greek tragic drama itself. In The Birth of Tragedy, he demonstrated how tragedy functioned not merely as entertainment, but as consciousness-expanding ritual. Through artistic representation of suffering, these performances created what Nietzsche called tragic consciousness, awareness that embraced life's painful aspects rather than denying them. The extraordinary cultural flourishing that accompanied this tragic sensibility suggested suffering, when consciously engaged rather than merely avoided, might actually enhance rather than diminish human development. Further evidence emerged from Nietzsche's cross-cultural analysis of consciousness-expanding practices. He observed that diverse spiritual traditions, from shamanic initiation rites to Buddhist meditation to Christian mysticism, consistently incorporated deliberate confrontation with suffering as essential to awakening deeper awareness. Despite their theological differences, these traditions shared remarkable consistency in recognizing that consciousness expansion required engagement with pain rather than its avoidance. This cross-cultural pattern suggested a universal psychological principle rather than culturally specific belief. Historical evidence proved equally revealing. Nietzsche documented how periods of cultural flourishing typically followed rather than preceded times of significant collective struggle. The Athenian Golden Age emerged after the devastating Persian Wars. Renaissance creativity followed the Black Death's decimation of Europe. Romantic artistic achievements emerged amid Napoleonic Wars' disruption. This consistent historical pattern, creativity and consciousness expansion following periods of intense suffering, suggested a causal relationship rather than mere coincidence. Nietzsche found particularly striking evidence in biographical patterns of exceptional individuals. Whether examining artists like Goethe and Beethoven, philosophers like Socrates and Spinoza, or religious figures like Buddha and Jesus, he observed that their exceptional consciousness consistently emerged through profound personal suffering rather than comfortable circumstances. This biographical consistency across diverse fields and historical periods suggested suffering might function as universal catalyst for consciousness expansion rather than obstacle to it. Psychological evidence emerged from Nietzsche's observation of how consciousness actually transforms through suffering. He noted that pain forces psychological territories typically operating below awareness into conscious recognition. In Daybreak, he observes, all great pain, whether physical or spiritual, makes us see things that we would otherwise never see. It divides the world into initiates and non-initiates, burns secrets into the soul that previously remained hidden even from ourselves. This pattern suggests pain functions not merely as warning system, but as consciousness expanding force that reveals aspects of self and world previously inaccessible to awareness. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's phenomenological evidence, his detailed description of how consciousness transforms through suffering. In The Gay Science, he writes, "Only great pain is the ultimate liberator of the spirit. I doubt that such pain makes us better, but I know that it makes us deeper." This distinction between moral improvement and psychological depth reveals Nietzsche's precise understanding. Suffering doesn't necessarily make us better people in conventional moral terms, but it creates inner spaciousness and depth that comfort alone cannot produce. This convergence of linguistic, cultural, historical, biographical, psychological, and phenomenological evidence led Nietzsche to his provocative conclusion. Consciousness doesn't merely perceive pain, but is actually formed by it. Our deepest awareness emerges not despite suffering, but because of it, with pain functioning as the very chisel that carves inner depth within human psyche. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the spiritual growth of a person is directly proportional to the amount of truth they can tolerate, to the amount of pain they can suffer without running away. This perspective doesn't glorify suffering for its own sake, but recognizes its transformative potential when engaged consciously rather than merely endured or avoided. Pain itself isn't inherently valuable, but our conscious relationship with it creates psychological depth that might remain undeveloped in its absence. This insight challenges fundamental assumptions of modern culture, which increasingly treats all discomfort as a problem to be eliminated rather than potential catalyst for deeper awareness. What implications might this understanding have for how we relate to inevitable suffering in our lives? If consciousness emerges through pain rather than despite it, how might we approach difficult experiences not merely as unfortunate accidents, but as potential openings to deeper awareness? These questions point toward a fundamentally different relationship with suffering, one based not on mere endurance or elimination, but on conscious engagement with its transformative potential. As Nietzsche's investigation progressed beyond initial evidence, he identified a more specific psychological mechanism connecting suffering and consciousness, what he called the Great Separation, or the Long Loneliness. This concept appears throughout his mature works, describing how pain creates consciousness by forcing separation between immediate experience and reflective awareness. When we experience intense suffering, we can no longer remain fully identified with our experiences, but must develop observational perspective that creates psychological distance. The very distance in which consciousness expands. This psychological separation serves crucial developmental function. It creates what Nietzsche called the bridge and the going across, the internal division that allows self-reflection to emerge. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, "Man is a rope, fastened between animal and Superman, a rope over an abyss." This metaphorical description captures how suffering stretches us across psychological space, creating the very gap within which deeper consciousness develops. Without this painful stretching, we might remain in unreflective immediacy, without the inner depth that self-awareness requires. Nietzsche identified specific evidence for this pattern in artistic creativity. He observed that great artists typically transform personal suffering into creative expression through precisely this psychological separation. They neither remain submerged in pain nor escape it entirely, but create reflective distance that allows transformation of raw experience into conscious expression. In The Gay Science, he notes, "Every artist knows how far from any feeling of letting himself go his most natural state is, the free ordering, placing, disposing, forming in the moment of inspiration, and how strictly and subtly he obeys thousandfold laws precisely then." This insight explained a curious pattern Nietzsche had identified in spiritual development across traditions. Whether through Buddhist mindfulness practices, Stoic philosophical exercises, or Christian contemplative traditions, spiritual development consistently involves creating observational awareness of suffering, rather than merely enduring it or escaping it. This spiritual pattern, creating witness consciousness in relation to pain, suggests that suffering serves essential function in developing the psychological separation necessary for deeper awareness. Nietzsche found further evidence in the specific qualities that emerge through conscious engagement with suffering. He observed that individuals who have integrated significant pain typically develop psychological characteristics unavailable through comfortable experiences alone: depth of feeling, resilience through difficulty, empathic connection with others' suffering, capacity for genuine joy rather than mere pleasure, and ability to find meaning in difficulty rather than merely enduring it. In Twilight of the Idols, he summarizes, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger, not because suffering itself strengthens, but because conscious engagement with pain develops psychological resources unavailable through comfort alone." The investigation deepened through Nietzsche's analysis of how different relationships with suffering create different types of consciousness. He distinguished between what he called slave consciousness, which experiences suffering as meaningless punishment requiring external redemption, and master consciousness, which engages pain as transformative experience developing internal resources. This distinction doesn't refer to social status but to psychological relationship with difficulty. As he writes in On the Genealogy of Morals, the noble soul has reverence for itself, a self-respect developed precisely through conscious integration of suffering rather than mere escape from it. Particularly revealing was Nietzsche's observation that consciousness develops not merely through suffering itself, but specifically through the meaning-making process it necessitates. When pain disrupts our expected narrative, we must develop larger interpretive frameworks to integrate this disruption, precisely the cognitive expansion that creates deeper consciousness. In The Gay Science, he notes, "Meaning grows in proportion to suffering. The question of the meaning of suffering coincides with the growth of meaning." This insight explains why suffering often catalyzes philosophical, spiritual, or artistic awakening. It forces expansion of our interpretive frameworks beyond previously comfortable boundaries. Perhaps most significantly, Nietzsche recognized that consciousness expansion through suffering requires neither passive endurance nor complete transcendence, but a specific relationship he called amor fati, love of fate. This perspective involves neither masochistic glorification of pain nor desperate escape from it, but conscious affirmation of life, including its difficult aspects. In Ecce Homo, he describes this as not merely bearing what is necessary, still less concealing it, but loving it. This approach doesn't seek suffering for its own sake, but recognizes that when pain inevitably occurs, conscious engagement with it creates psychological depth unavailable through mere avoidance. As these patterns accumulated, Nietzsche realized they pointed toward a profound insight. Consciousness isn't a separate faculty that merely perceives suffering, but is actually created through it, with pain functioning as the very chisel that carves inner space within human psyche. This recognition would lead to his most provocative question. What might be possible for individuals courageous enough to engage suffering consciously, rather than merely enduring it or desperately avoiding it? What kind of consciousness might emerge through this transformed relationship with pain? As Nietzsche assembled these diverse pieces of evidence, a coherent psychological pattern emerged, what he called the birth of tragedy in the soul. This pattern revealed a three-stage process through which suffering transforms consciousness, a process that remains remarkably consistent across cultures and historical periods, despite vast differences in specific philosophical or religious frameworks. The first stage begins with what Nietzsche called the Great Disruption, the moment when pain breaks through our comfortable assumptions and forces confrontation with aspects of existence we've been able to ignore. In The Gay Science, he describes this initial stage. It is only great pain, that long, slow pain that takes its time, that compels us to descend to our ultimate depths. This disruptive suffering might come through physical illness, profound loss, social rejection, creative struggle, or existential crisis. But its essential quality is that it cannot be integrated within our existing psychological framework. The second stage involves a critical psychological maneuver, what Nietzsche called the Great Separation. Rather than remaining fully identified with suffering, which would be mere submersion, or completely detaching from it, which would be mere escape, consciousness develops precisely in the space between experience and awareness of that experience. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. This paradoxical position, being both the sufferer and the witness of suffering, creates the very psychological distance in which deeper consciousness emerges. The third stage completes the pattern. Having developed this internal separation, consciousness expands through what Nietzsche called the Great Integration, the process of creating meaning from previously unintegrated suffering. Rather than leaving pain as fragmentary experience, this stage involves conscious assimilation that transforms suffering from mere disruption into catalyst for expanded awareness. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes this as creating beyond yourself, where difficult experience becomes transformed into deeper understanding rather than remaining raw wound. This three-stage pattern, disruption, separation, integration, operates beneath the surface of diverse approaches to suffering. In religious contexts, it appears through concepts of sacrifice, redemption, and resurrection. In artistic creativity, it emerges as inspiration, expression, and transformation. In psychological development, it manifests as crisis, reflection, and growth. Despite their different vocabularies, these frameworks describe identical psychological process through which consciousness expands through conscious engagement with pain. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this pattern is how it creates qualitatively different consciousness than comfort-based development. Nietzsche observed that individuals who have integrated significant suffering typically develop psychological characteristics unavailable through pleasant experiences alone. Depth of feeling, capacity for joy, distinct from mere pleasure, resilience through difficulty, empathic connection with others' suffering, and ability to find meaning in challenge rather than merely enduring it. In Twilight of the Idols, he summarizes, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger, not because suffering itself automatically strengthens, but because conscious engagement with pain develops psychological resources unavailable through comfort alone." This insight explains why biographical accounts of exceptional consciousness so consistently include significant suffering. From Buddha's recognition of universal suffering as path to enlightenment, to Dostoevsky's creative expansion through imprisonment and epilepsy, to Gandhi's development through colonial oppression, the pattern of consciousness expanding through pain appears with remarkable consistency. This biographical consistency suggests not that suffering guarantees enhanced awareness. Many remain diminished by pain, but that exceptional consciousness rarely develops without conscious engagement with significant difficulty. The pattern also explains the emotional intensity that accompanies consciousness transformation through suffering. When individuals describe breakthrough awareness following painful integration, whether through artistic creation, spiritual realization, or psychological growth, they consistently report not just intellectual understanding, but whole being, knowing that encompasses emotional, physical, and cognitive dimensions. This multidimensional quality suggests consciousness transformation through suffering affects not just intellectual understanding, but entire being in ways that purely cognitive development cannot. Nietzsche identified a particularly revealing test case for his theory in the psychology of genuine compassion. He observed that authentic compassion, distinct from mere pity or sympathy, typically develops through personal suffering that has been consciously integrated, rather than merely endured or avoided. This pattern explains why individuals who have transformed their own pain often demonstrate remarkable capacity to be present with others' suffering, without either overwhelmed identification or detached distance. As he notes in Human, All Too Human, the most basic form of human stupidity is forgetting what we were trying to do in the first place. As this pattern became clear to Nietzsche, he recognized its profound implications for understanding not just how consciousness responds to suffering, but how it is actually created through it. If our deepest awareness emerges through conscious engagement with pain rather than its avoidance, traditional approaches that interpret suffering as punishment, failure, or problem to be eliminated might actually prevent our fullest psychological development. This recognition challenged fundamental assumptions of Western civilization, which increasingly positioned comfort and pain avoidance as primary goals. These questions would lead Nietzsche to his most radical philosophical insight, what he called the will to power, not as domination over others, but as capacity to transform suffering into expanded consciousness. What new human possibilities might emerge when we recognize pain not as unfortunate accident, but as essential catalyst for our deepest psychological development. Recognizing that consciousness develops through suffering rather than despite it carries profound implications for how we understand human psychology, growth, and potential. Nietzsche explored these implications with unflinching intellectual honesty, revealing how this single insight might transform our entire approach to both pain and awareness. The first and most immediate implication concerns our relationship with inevitable suffering. If pain serves essential function in developing consciousness, our instinctive impulse to avoid all discomfort might actually prevent our deepest psychological development. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, the discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? This perspective doesn't glorify suffering for its own sake, but recognizes that our relationship with pain, how we engage it rather than whether we experience it, determines whether it diminishes or expands our consciousness. This reframing extends to our understanding of comfort itself. If consciousness develops primarily through engagement with difficulty, rather than its absence, our cultural emphasis on maximizing comfort and minimizing discomfort might inadvertently be preventing our fullest psychological development. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche observes, "The human being who does not wish to belong to the mass must merely cease being comfortable with himself." This perspective suggests that some degree of self-imposed challenge and discomfort might be essential for consciousness expansion rather than obstacle to it. Perhaps most significantly, this insight transforms our understanding of psychological growth itself. Conventional approaches portray development as progressive movement from pain to comfort, from struggle to ease. Nietzsche's analysis suggests something radically different. Authentic psychological growth involves not escaping suffering, but developing capacity to engage it consciously, to transform pain through awareness rather than merely avoiding it. As he writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "The soul that has the longest ladder and can descend the deepest, how could there not be most parasites upon it?" This perspective reveals why conventional therapeutic approaches often produce stability without transformation. By focusing primarily on symptom reduction and return to comfort, These approaches may inadvertently prevent the very psychological development that conscious engagement with difficulty might catalyze. Nietzsche's insight suggests that therapeutic effectiveness might be measured not by how quickly pain is eliminated, but by how fully it is integrated into expanded consciousness. As he notes in Twilight of the Idols, to have to fight the instincts, that is the formula for decadence. As long as life is ascending, happiness equals instinct. The recognition of suffering's relationship to consciousness also illuminates why spiritual traditions consistently emphasize conscious engagement with pain rather than its mere avoidance. From Buddhist mindfulness practices to Christian contemplative traditions to Sufi presence exercises, diverse approaches share surprising consistency in directing attention toward difficult experiences rather than away from them. This pattern makes profound sense when suffering is understood not as obstacle to spiritual development, but as its essential catalyst. As Nietzsche observes in The Antichrist, what is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. This insight explains why moral frameworks often fail to produce the very qualities they promote. By dividing experience into accepted and rejected aspects, conventional morality creates the internal fragmentation it claims to heal. If psychological integration emerges through conscious affirmation of life's totality rather than selective acceptance, moral improvement represents precisely the wrong approach to consciousness development. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, there is no such thing as moral phenomena, but only a moral interpretation of phenomena. Most radically, Nietzsche's insight invites us to imagine a fundamentally different relationship with pain itself. Rather than viewing suffering as punishment requiring redemption or problem requiring solution, we might recognize it as an integral aspect of the consciousness-creating process. In Ecce Homo, he describes this as amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. This perspective doesn't glorify suffering for its own sake, but transforms our relationship with it from resistance that intensifies pain to acceptance that integrates it into expanded awareness. This perspective doesn't eliminate values but transforms their foundation, from comfort versus discomfort to consciousness expansion versus contraction. Instead of avoiding pain as inherently negative, we might evaluate experiences through their capacity to enhance or diminish awareness. Instead of seeking absence of suffering, we might cultivate capacity for conscious presence within it. Instead of measuring progress by comfort achieved, we might consider depth of consciousness developed, even when that development involves difficult passages. The implications extend beyond individual psychology to social and cultural realms. If authentic human development emerges through conscious engagement with difficulty rather than its absence, social systems that shield individuals from all challenging experiences might inadvertently prevent their fullest psychological growth. This doesn't justify unnecessary suffering or systemic injustice, but suggests that some degree of challenge and difficulty might be essential for consciousness development, rather than obstacle to it. As we'll see, these implications lead to a profound question about human potential. What might be possible for individuals and cultures that relate to suffering not as punishment to be endured or problem to be eliminated, but as essential catalyst for consciousness expansion? This question points toward what Nietzsche called the overman, not a biological superior, but a psychological possibility available through transformed relationship with pain. The recognition that consciousness develops through suffering, rather than despite it, reveals a more profound pattern, what Nietzsche identified as a conspiracy against depth, perpetuated not through conscious deception, but through psychological mechanisms operating beneath awareness. This pattern extends beyond formal religious and philosophical systems into educational, therapeutic, and cultural institutions that maintain comfort-seeking perspectives through frameworks that position pain as pure negativity without developmental function. At its core, this unconscious conspiracy involves systematically misinterpreting suffering's psychological purpose. By teaching people to view all pain as meaningless punishment or unfortunate accident rather than potential catalyst for consciousness expansion, these systems create psychological dependency on external solutions to internal development processes. This misinterpretation doesn't simply describe reality, but actively constructs it, making potential consciousness growth through difficulty appear as failure rather than necessary passage. This pattern becomes particularly visible in contemporary therapeutic approaches. While acknowledging psychology's valuable contributions to managing destructive suffering, Nietzsche would recognize how many therapeutic frameworks inadvertently prevent deeper consciousness development by positioning symptom reduction and return to comfort as primary goals rather than potential integration of difficulty into expanded awareness. In Beyond Good and Evil, he observes, the thought of suicide is a strong consolation. With it, one gets successfully through many a bad night. This provocative statement highlights how even psychological distress can serve consciousness-expanding function when engaged directly, rather than merely eliminated. The conspiracy extends to educational systems that increasingly prioritize student comfort over developmental challenge. By shielding learners from intellectual, emotional, and social difficulties, these approaches may inadvertently prevent the very cognitive and psychological growth that conscious engagement with challenging material might catalyze. Nietzsche's insight suggests education's effectiveness might be measured not by comfort maintained but by consciousness expanded, even when that expansion involves difficult learning processes. As he writes in Twilight of the Idols, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." Perhaps most insidiously, this pattern colonizes spiritual development itself. By transforming ancient wisdom traditions that emphasized conscious engagement with suffering into contemporary self-help approaches promising painless transformation, modern spirituality often creates the very obstacle to consciousness expansion it claims to overcome. Authentic spiritual traditions didn't promise escape from difficulty but transformation through it, a nuance increasingly lost in commercialized approaches emphasizing comfort and positive experience. As Nietzsche observes in The Antichrist, Christianity was from the beginning, essentially and fundamentally, life's nausea and disgust with life, merely concealed behind, masked by, dressed up as faith in another or better life. This unconscious conspiracy operates through specific psychological mechanisms that Nietzsche identified with remarkable precision. First is what he called the spirit of gravity, the psychological tendency to seek safety, comfort, and certainty even at consciousness development's expense. When humans cannot find easy resolution to difficult experiences, they often choose comfortable illusion over consciousness-expanding engagement with challenging reality. This doesn't happen through conscious deception, but through genuine psychological preference for comfort over depth. The second mechanism involves what Nietzsche termed the tarantulas, his metaphor for those who promise painless resolution to life's fundamental challenges. These figures appear across domains: religious leaders promising salvation without transformation, therapists offering technique without depth, educators providing credentials without development, philosophers offering systems without struggle. Their common quality isn't malicious intent, but participation in frameworks that misunderstand suffering's consciousness-creating function. As he writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "With these preachers of equality I will not be confused. For thus justice speaks to me. Men are not equal." The third mechanism operates through language itself, specifically through conceptual frameworks that interpret all pain as pure negativity without developmental purpose. By categorizing suffering exclusively as punishment, failure, or problem, rather than potential catalyst for consciousness expansion, these linguistic frameworks prevent recognition of pain's transformative potential. This conceptual shaping explains why even individuals who experience consciousness expansion through suffering often lack vocabulary to articulate this development, instead framing their transformation through conventional narratives of overcoming rather than integration. What makes this pattern truly a conspiracy rather than merely a psychological tendency is its systematic reinforcement through institutional structures. Educational systems reward comfort-maintaining perspectives rather than consciousness-expanding engagement with difficulty. Publishing and media platforms promote pain-avoidant narratives rather than transformative ones. Social validation flows toward those promising elimination of suffering rather than its integration. These systemic incentives ensure that perspectives recognizing suffering's consciousness-creating function remain marginalized while comfort-seeking approaches dominate mainstream discourse. The ultimate evidence of this conspiracy's effectiveness is that its subjects actively defend and perpetuate it, believing they act from genuine self-interest rather than conditioned avoidance of consciousness development. The system creates what Nietzsche called the last men, those who believe comfort and safety represent life's highest goals rather than means for deeper becoming. As he describes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink." This self-perpetuating quality represents the most sophisticated form of limitation, one that operates not through external restriction, but through internal psychological preference for comfort over depth. This perspective reveals why Nietzsche's analysis has provoked such intense resistance across domains. He didn't merely challenge specific claims about suffering's meaning, but exposed the entire psychological infrastructure that interprets pain exclusively as negativity without developmental function. By revealing how conscious engagement with suffering might actually expand consciousness rather than diminish it, he offered perspective that challenges fundamental assumptions of comfort-seeking culture. What happens when individuals begin recognizing these patterns in themselves? What possibilities emerge when we relate to suffering not merely as punishment to be endured or problem to be eliminated, but as potential catalyst for consciousness expansion? And why has this alternative approach been so systematically marginalized throughout modern Western culture? These questions point toward fundamentally different understanding of human potential, one based not on eliminating all difficulty, but on transforming our relationship with inevitable pain. The recognition that consciousness develops through suffering rather than despite it represents a fundamental challenge to institutional authority across domains, not merely questioning specific interpretations of pain, but exposing the psychological mechanisms underlying our entire approach to human development. This explains why this insight has been systematically marginalized through various mechanisms, though never completely eliminated. The first and most direct suppression method has been conceptual reframing. Religious institutions that originally recognized suffering's transformative potential gradually shifted toward interpreting pain exclusively as punishment, requiring institutional redemption or test-proving institutional dogma. This conceptual evolution appears across traditions, from Christianity's transformation of crucifixion symbolism, from consciousness transformation to sin payment, to Buddhism's shift from direct engagement with suffering toward ritualized practice, to Hinduism's reinterpretation of tapas, conscious suffering, as primarily devotional obligation. These conceptual shifts transformed potentially consciousness-expanding engagement with difficulty into institutional requirement. Beyond conceptual reframing, educational and therapeutic institutions deployed a more subtle tactic: professionalization of suffering response. By positioning pain exclusively as technical problem requiring expert solution rather than potential catalyst for consciousness development, these systems created dependency on institutional expertise while marginalizing direct experiential engagement with difficulty. This professionalization doesn't require conscious conspiracy, but emerges naturally from institutional self-preservation. Frameworks that position suffering as opportunity for consciousness expansion require less professional mediation than those interpreting pain as purely technical problem. Perhaps the most effective suppression method has been conceptual compartmentalization. Academic institutions segregated insights about suffering's relationship to consciousness into specialized philosophical or psychological disciplines disconnected from mainstream understanding. Ideas that might transform everyday relationship with difficulty became abstract concepts studied by professional specialists rather than practical wisdom integrated into common understanding. This academic isolation prevented revolutionary insights from challenging dominant comfort-seeking cultural narrative. Cultural authorities also employed psychological inoculation, teaching people to fear deep engagement with suffering as dangerous threat to stability. By characterizing full confrontation with pain as potential trigger for breakdown rather than catalyst for breakthrough, mainstream perspectives create preemptive psychological barriers against consciousness-expanding engagement with difficulty. This inoculation explains why many individuals experience anxiety when facing perspectives like Nietzsche's. They've been conditioned to fear deep engagement with suffering as potentially destructive rather than potentially transformative. The modern marketplace contributed to this suppression through commodification of pain relief. By creating massive commercial incentives for approaches promising comfort without consciousness-expanding difficulty, economic systems naturally marginalize perspectives suggesting that some suffering might serve developmental purpose rather than representing pure negativity requiring elimination. When pain relief becomes primary commodity, recognition of suffering's potential developmental function becomes market threat rather than valuable insight. Perhaps most insidiously, popular culture reinforced this suppression by trivializing insights about suffering's relationship to consciousness. Concepts like, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," became simplified motivational slogans rather than profound psychological insights. By reducing Nietzsche's nuanced understanding to bumper sticker wisdom, popular discourse neutralized its transformative potential while appearing to embrace it. Genuine recognition of suffering's consciousness-expanding function became confused with toxic positivity that denies pain's reality while claiming to transcend it. These suppression methods succeeded partly because Nietzsche himself suffered biographical misfortune that limited his influence. His mental collapse in 1889, likely due to undiagnosed syphilis, prevented him from developing and defending his insights during their initial reception. Unlike other influential thinkers who actively promoted their work throughout long careers, Nietzsche's productive philosophical life lasted barely 2 decades and ended before his ideas gained significant public attention. This truncated career made his work particularly vulnerable to misrepresentation and marginalization. The historical timing of Nietzsche's work also contributed to its suppression. His most productive years coincided with rising European industrialization and consumer culture that increasingly positioned comfort and pain avoidance as primary values. These economic and social developments created cultural environment hostile to perspectives suggesting that comfort might not represent life's highest goal. Later, the catastrophic misappropriation of selected Nietzschean ideas by Nazi propagandists, facilitated by his sister's selective editing, created lasting associations that further distracted from his genuine insights about suffering's relationship to consciousness. What makes these suppression methods particularly effective is that they operate not just through institutional power, but through psychological resistance in individuals themselves. Nietzsche understood that humans naturally avoid recognizing suffering's developmental potential because this recognition demands courageous engagement with pain rather than mere escape from it. In Beyond Good and Evil, he observes, "The strength of a person's spirit would then be measured by how much truth he could endure, or more precisely, to what extent he needs to have it diluted, disguised, sweetened, muted, falsified." This willing self-deception makes external suppression unnecessary in many cases. People avoid the insight because its implications demand difficult psychological work. This psychological resistance explains a curious historical pattern: the periodic rediscovery and subsequent resuppression of insights about suffering's consciousness-expanding function. Each generation produces individuals who recognize pain's potential developmental role, generate temporary cultural interest, then face renewed marginalization before this understanding can transform mainstream perspectives. This cycle has played out repeatedly, from existentialist philosophers to depth psychologists to serious spiritual teachers, whose insights gain temporary attention before being reabsorbed into comfort-seeking mainstream narrative. The suppression continues even in seemingly progressive contexts. Contemporary mindfulness approaches often acknowledge suffering's presence while positioning awareness primarily as technique for pain reduction rather than catalyst for consciousness expansion. By conceding the reality of pain while preserving its interpretation as pure negativity without developmental function, these approaches create artificial boundaries that prevent recognition of suffering's potential consciousness-expanding role. What makes this pattern particularly troubling is that it operates largely without conscious conspiracy. Individuals who resist recognizing suffering's relationship to consciousness genuinely believe they protect themselves and others from unnecessary pain rather than preventing potential development. The conceptual reframing, professionalization, compartmentalization, psychological inoculation, commodification, and trivialization happen through sincere concern rather than calculated deception. This sincerity makes the pattern harder to recognize and address. Yet despite these suppression methods, insights about suffering's consciousness-creating function have persisted, continuing to emerge through both direct experience and philosophical reflection. From depth psychology to existential philosophy to serious spiritual practice, the recognition that consciousness develops through engagement with pain rather than its mere avoidance continues to resurface in new forms. The very persistence of this insight, despite sustained cultural resistance, suggests it contains psychological truth too fundamental to permanently suppress. Have you noticed how contemporary culture responds when presented with perspectives suggesting that some suffering might serve developmental purpose rather than representing pure negativity? Do mainstream frameworks engage with this possibility directly, or do they reflexively reframe all pain as meaningless problem requiring elimination? This response pattern itself provides evidence for Nietzsche's analysis. If suffering served no consciousness-expanding function, why would perspectives suggesting otherwise provoke such consistent cultural resistance? The profound implication of Nietzsche's discovery isn't that suffering should be sought for its own sake, a misinterpretation that would merely invert the problem of pain avoidance. The revelation is simultaneously more unsettling and more liberating. Consciousness isn't a separate faculty that merely perceives suffering but is actually carved by it, with pain functioning as the very chisel that creates psychological depth. What we've been desperately trying to avoid might be precisely what creates the inner spaciousness we most deeply seek. This recognition leads to what Nietzsche called the tragic sense of life, not mere resignation to inevitable suffering, but active engagement with it as consciousness-expanding passage. When we recognize pain not as meaningless punishment or unfortunate accident, but as potential catalyst for our deepest development, something fundamental changes in our relationship with difficulty. The division between negative experiences to be avoided and positive experiences to be sought dissolves, and we face the possibility that our fullest becoming might require precisely the challenges we've been conditioned to fear. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, what if pleasure and displeasure were so tied together that whoever wanted to have as much as possible of one must also have as much as possible of the other? You have the choice. Either as little displeasure as possible, painlessness in brief, or as much displeasure as possible as the price for the growth of an abundance of subtle pleasures and joys that have rarely been relished yet. This perspective offers a fundamentally different approach to life's inevitable difficulties. Instead of interpreting pain exclusively as failure to be corrected or problem to be solved, we might recognize it as potential opening to deeper consciousness when engaged directly rather than merely endured or avoided. Instead of measuring our success by comfort achieved, we might consider depth of awareness developed, even when that development involves challenging passages. Instead of viewing suffering as meaningless interruption of our real life, we might recognize it as integral aspect of the consciousness-creating process itself. What emerges from this recognition isn't masochistic glorification of pain, but what Nietzsche called the Dionysian perspective. Capacity to affirm life in its totality, including its difficult aspects, rather than requiring sanitized version of existence without genuine challenge. This doesn't mean seeking suffering, but developing consciousness that can integrate inevitable pain into expanded awareness rather than being diminished by it. As he writes in Twilight of the Idols, in the Dionysian state, the essential feature remains the ease of metamorphosis, the inability not to react. The Dionysian type is not unable to comprehend any suggestion. He does not overlook any sign of emotion. He possesses the instinct of understanding and guessing in the highest degree. This approach doesn't reject the practical wisdom of alleviating destructive suffering. Medical interventions for physical pain, therapeutic support for psychological distress, and social justice efforts addressing systemic harm remain essential. What changes is our relationship with inevitable pain that cannot be eliminated. The existential challenges of loss, limitation, uncertainty, and mortality that define human condition. Rather than interpreting these exclusively as meaningless burdens, we might recognize their potential role in creating the very depth of consciousness that makes us fully human. The implications extend beyond individual psychology to cultural and social realms. Many of our institutional structures, educational systems, healthcare approaches, religious frameworks, economic models, incorporate assumptions that position all suffering as pure negativity without developmental function. By recognizing these foundations, we gain the possibility of reimagining social structures that neither glorify unnecessary pain nor deny the potential consciousness-expanding function of necessary difficulty. This doesn't mean imposing suffering, but creating environments that support conscious engagement with inevitable challenges, rather than promoting illusory promise of painless development. What makes this perspective particularly relevant today is that we're living through a historical period where technological and pharmacological developments increasingly promise elimination of all discomfort. From constant digital distraction from uncomfortable thoughts to expanding menu of mood-altering substances, to immersive virtual realities offering escape from limitation, contemporary culture offers unprecedented capacity to avoid direct engagement with difficulty. While these developments bring genuine benefits, Nietzsche's insight raises profound question. Might our technological success at eliminating discomfort inadvertently be preventing our deepest consciousness development? The most profound question we face isn't whether suffering exists, an empirical question with obvious answer, but how we might live when we recognize pain not as meaningless burden, but as potential catalyst for our deepest consciousness expansion. What kind of humanity becomes possible when we neither glorify suffering nor desperately avoid it, but engage it consciously as the very process through which our deepest awareness emerges? This question points toward what Nietzsche called the tragic hero, not victim passively enduring fate, but conscious participant in transformative passage that creates depth through difficulty. If you followed this investigation with genuine openness, you've likely experienced both uneasiness and recognition, the natural responses to contemplating perspective that challenges our conditioned avoidance of pain, while resonating with our deepest experiences of growth through difficulty. This recognition doesn't require seeking suffering, but invites more conscious relationship with inevitable pain, distinguishing between destructive harm that diminishes consciousness and developmental difficulty that might expand it. What matters isn't whether you accept or reject Nietzsche's analysis, but whether you engage with it honestly, allowing it to illuminate your own relationship with suffering and consciousness. I invite you to continue this philosophical investigation by exploring these questions in your own experience. How have your most difficult passages shaped your consciousness? What depth exists within you now that wouldn't be there without the pain you've experienced? What possibilities might emerge if you approached inevitable suffering not merely as burden to be endured, but as potential catalyst for your deepest development? Share your reflections in the comments below, as this conversation represents exactly the kind of consciousness-expanding dialogue Nietzsche envisioned. People exploring fundamental questions together without requiring comfortable conclusions. If this analysis has provided you with new perspective on suffering's relationship to consciousness, consider subscribing and activating the notification bell to continue this philosophical journey. Each video explores how seemingly fixed assumptions often have surprising depths when approached with courageous curiosity. By understanding how our deepest awareness emerges not despite difficulty, but through it, we might develop more authentic relationship with both suffering and consciousness. The final question isn't whether pain exists, but what becomes possible when we recognize its potential role in creating our deepest humanity. As philosophical investigators in this complex contemporary world, we face both greater temptation toward comfort-seeking and greater possibility for consciousness development than any previous generation. The recognition that suffering creates rather than merely challenges consciousness doesn't glorify pain, but transforms our relationship with it. From meaningless burden to be escaped to difficult passage that might lead to our most profound becoming.